What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to MileHighDiscussions. I'm one of your hosts, Hugh O'Brien.
And I'm your second host, Izzy Gorsuch, and we are here with two of our guests. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Simi Stark. I'm a senior at East High School.
I'm Maya Roberts, and I'm also a senior at East High School.
Okay, so today we're going to be kind of talking about sex education. And I guess my first question for you guys is, when did you guys start having sex education?
Around 5th grade is when I started.
Yeah, we went to the same elementary and middle school, so our sex education lined up pretty similarly. So I started, I would say 5th grade. We had a big open auditorium discussion. And
what did that education look like?
We talked a lot about puberty and using deodorant, and shaving your legs.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, and then we learned how a baby was made.
Yeah.
So.
And then they separated us into boys and girls into classrooms, and they had the boys with male teachers and then girls with the female teachers, and they talked to the girls about their developing bodies, and I'm sure the same thing with guys. So. Yeah.
And was this at a public school or private school?
So both public schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
How'd that work for you?
Me, so I don't really remember. I'm sure I got some amount in elementary school, and I again think it was separated between the sexes. And I did get some in middle school in gym class, but I don't know. Do you guys think it was comprehensive enough?
I mean, personally, I don't. I think that it was very skimmed the top of what sex is, what your puberty is going to look like, and that sort of thing. But I think I got most of my sex education from where I'm really lucky enough is my mom. We had a very open talk about it, and she's just open about that kind of stuff, which is good. So I never really had to wonder, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mine, I learned most of what I know just from hearing from my friends and the internet, a little from my parents, but not really as much. I honestly couldn't even tell you what I learned in 5th grade. I didn't retain any of it, and it was all just based on puberty.
Do you think that it's safe to give kids that amount of sex education that obviously wasn't for people whose parents didn't sit down and talk to them, maybe they didn't remember it or it didn't really stick with them? Do you think that's safe?
I would say it's probably not safe, to just push someone out there into the world and they have no clue what sex is, the dangers that come with it, and not even just sex, but just knowing your body and going out there into the world without knowing about your body and its functions.
Yeah, I think there's a big gap in just safe sex. I never learned about birth control or condoms or anything like that in public education, public schools.
Yeah.
Sex education.
I agree with you. I actually went to a Catholic school for elementary school.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually, surprisingly enough, kind of had a similar kind of sex ed, firsthand experience, at least in 5th grade. But I never learned about condoms or any safe sex in general. And honestly, I still have yet to, at least in school wise. And I think that's kind of a glaring mistake of my sex education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also say the same thing. I learned about birth control and safe sex definitely through my parents and through my friends.
Yeah,
I think
that's a big part.
I think the other really big part of it is you learn, especially in our generation and future generations, you learn so much about this stuff through the media.
Right, which is potentially very dangerous.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The media just I'm sure I got my fair share of learning about sex ed from the media, but there's just so many things where it shames you for certain things, and I used to from what I learned online and stuff, I thought condoms were not a bad thing, but not necessary. Not necessary. You just shouldn't be having sex in general, and I was never taught like how to have sex safely. So.
What impact do you think like social media has on sex education for kids?
I think that it's really dangerous or potentially dangerous when kids don't have that like sex education from either their parents or like their schools, because they're kind of left to their own devices, like to go onto social media and like different media sites and like fill in those gaps. And I think that can be really dangerous because, of course, like not everything on the internet is like, you know,
Don't believe
trustworthy.
everything
Right,
on the internet,
exactly,
right?
yeah. So I think that can be bad sometimes.
I think like it's really like not a good situation when you're learning about your sex education on in the media, but also like when you start comparing it to like what you see in movies, because like obviously like the way that teen pregnancy is depicted in movies and TV shows is like very different than the reality, and the way that like your first time is like depicted in movies and the media is very different than the reality. And I think when we're getting all of our information from movies and TV shows, it becomes like a really dangerous situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you guys think we can kind of fix this like issue? Because I read I think it was a New York Times article a couple of weeks ago talking about how like explicit sex scenes are becoming much more common in television, and like the gist of the article was sex pays essentially for TV. So how do we kind of balance like the need obviously to make money with like social media and movies with like safe education essentially?
I mean, I think that it's really important that if like you're watching television and like you see this, I think that like for parents to just be straightforward and be like, hey, this is like what sex actually is, and like what you're seeing right now on television isn't exactly, you know, what it's going to be like. And I think that that's also really important. Like I've gone back and watched a lot of like movies from the 80s and 90s where like sex is depicted in a very like non-consensual way, and I think that that's really like dangerous for like young people to be watching. And I think now it's a little bit better, but of course there's still a lot of gaps to fill.
I think one of the biggest things is like when you're a little kid and you're watching like a scary movie with your parents or whatever, and you're like scared, they always say like, oh, it's not real, it's okay. I think that's like a big thing with like sex scenes is if we have a good education system where we know that that's not real and we know that it's just imaginary in a movie that we're watching and it's not reality, I think that's like the line to draw, is like knowing that those movies aren't like our reality.
Yeah, and understanding that those people are actors. They're trying to make it seem like the way you want it to look, and it's not realistic. And I don't think I even learned that until somewhat recently.
Yeah.
I would also say that other than social media, I think music has a really big impact on sex education.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think that just the way that women are depicted in a lot of music in media is concerning, just like how, you know, we don't really talk about consent, you know.
Yeah, I think like music plays a big role just like in the way that like it's the music that we listen to so much, in the way that women are talked about and men are talked about. Like it's all like, oh, like, I mean, I can't think of a line right now, but it's all about like sex and drugs, and like when we look to the media and movies and music and all that for our reality, it's like becomes dangerous because like it's not realistic and your life is not going to be what it's like in a song. And when you get to like having sex, if you're in that situation, like it's not going to be like your favorite song by T-Pain or whatever.
Yeah. Kind of refocusing back onto your experiences with sex ed, and like at least our public schools, like sexual education program, DPS has like a 3-tiered sex ed program where you first start learning it in like later elementary school and kind of learn like the basics, and then it gets more specific and more like detailed per se in middle school, and then even more in high school. Do you guys think your experience matched that? And do you think that that's enough? Or do you guys think that some aspect of it should change?
I think there's a lot of changes to be made. Personally, from speaking from my experience, I don't think I was really taught at all about like sex education. Like, I was taught about puberty and all that, like the basics in elementary school, and then I don't really remember doing anything in middle school. And then in high school, the extent of what I got was in my biology class freshman year. We talked about the reproductive system and birth control. And we talked about all birth control methods. We talked about abstinence, the pill, IUD, like everything. But that was maybe like 3 days of our year-long course.
Right.
So I really just felt like there's so many gaps and like questions left that students still have that we don't get in school. And that's when they result to going to the media or their parents or their friends.
Yeah, I think that it was, again, pretty much the basics in elementary school, and then middle school, a huge gap in learning, and I think that that was probably like when a lot of kids were going through puberty and like really confused, and I think that that was when the most work could be done with sex education. And I think that public schools really miss out on a big opportunity there, educating their students on, hey, listen, you guys have a lot of really confusing things going on right now, and high school is going to be a big change in your life. And I think that like just discussing that and having an open conversation in middle school would have been really helpful.
Yeah. That's an interesting difference between your sex education and mine, because in middle school, in 8th grade at least, we spent like a week kind of learning about sex ed, and we watched like I don't want to say a documentary, but like a TV show like focused on like the entire stage, all of the stages of sex essentially, and I rewatched it in freshman year as well, but I don't think I ever got to talk about like IUDs or like an in-depth talk about like how birth control works and not that such. And like I think that's probably the biggest issue for my sex education.
Yeah, I think definitely there are a lot of gaps that we need to fill. But thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah,
we will be back. Thank you guys. We'll be back right after a short break.
Love what you learn. Graduate debt-free from a certified program in health science, design, trades, or administration in less than a year. Opportunity comes from possibility. Come see what's possible.
Hi, and welcome back to MileHighDiscussions. We are joined again with our two guests, Simi and Maya, and we're going to jump right back into our conversation about sex education. I think this time I was going to ask a little bit more about what kind of education have you guys gotten, like consent-wise?
Well, I don't really think I've gotten any, to be honest. A little bit in my global gender studies class, but that's really the extent of it.
Yeah, I think media influenced most of like what I know about consent, and just like social media and a lot of like the women's movement that's been going on has like filled that for me. And I know in middle school I was very heavily like into like dress code, so that definitely gave me a gateway into what like I know like to be feminism. So that was
I think a big thing, at least for today's youth, is the social movements that like those are huge today. The Women's March, Me Too movements, all of that are key in like kind of explaining even the concept of consent.
Yeah. But I also think that like that's kind of sad that like that is what
I agree.
Like the Me Too movement is a direct reflection of how the sex education like has failed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, while we have to applaud those movements, obviously it's
A little
hard.
disappointing. To
Yeah,
see
disappointing.
so many women
coming forward.
coming forward with those stories.
I'd definitely say that's where I got my education about consent as well, and just like the issues around consent and what's going on in society. And like, I definitely wouldn't say it happened in a school setting or an education setting, but like very powerful movements. But yeah, it's like very sad that I had to like get it all off the media and I wasn't just educated in a place of education.
Do you guys think there should be some sort of consent education in school, like required?
Yeah, I definitely think there should be some consent education in school, because you're in like a place that's literally there to provide education for you, whether that be geography or U.S. history, and I would argue that consent education is just as important as those.
Yeah.
So.
What would that look like?
Just like looking at like what other schools have done and like personally what I would have wanted. I think, like in my personal opinion, I think that it should be in the graduation requirements to take like a health class or something where you talk about consent, you talk about drugs and alcohol, you talk about the transition.
Safe sex.
Yeah, safe sex, like all those topics, just like a year-long course. It's like there's no way you can get out of it. Like gym, like you can't like play a
No
sport to get
online-
out of it.
No online
sex ed or anything?
No. Like I think it should be a full-on like course, just like geography or just like U.S. history.
So do you think that it would be like where we hire like outside professionals, or would we require our teachers to like take that sort of course to be able to teach that?
I think that like DPS would hire like professionals trained in that, whether that be like like educators from outside organizations, or whether DPS trains teachers and educates them to be able to teach the course, but some type of like educated person who's educated enough to teach on consent in those topics, because that's really important.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think consent is the thing that kids learn like too late rather than too early, and I think it should absolutely be vice versa, because we are seeing these movements like Me Too and a lot of things that are coming out of social media, like the negative sides of it that aren't as good, and you see people not getting enough like jail time and these things, and it's just an overlapping like constant thing that's happening.
Yeah.
Do you think that having a class is the only way to teach somebody about consent, or is there like a more, I don't want to say subtle way of kind of like weaving it into education? Because many students already have like tons of different class requirements, and adding something on top of that might be too much.
Yeah, I've actually talked about it a lot, like with other students. I mean, like personally looking back at my high school experience, I don't think I would have wanted to add another class. But, but I think that like there's so many classes that are in our graduation requirements that are vital, but like I think that consent education and sex education and all those topics are like one of the most important things you can learn in school. And I think that it's the root issue of so many of the issues in the world right now is like a lack of education and knowledge around these topics. And I think that having a good education system would get to the root of the cause as opposed to like fixing it later in life. I mean, one day, like maybe getting it even when you're younger, like in elementary school, like and normalizing it so that it's not some topic that you have to wait to learn about until you're 17 years old.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Maya?
Yeah, I would agree. I'm actually kind of curious about like you, just because we're like all female and we've had like, I don't know, I've talked to my mom and they seem like they kind of got theirs off social media. Like, how do you feel like as a guy, like it's different, like your consent education?
I think it's even more imperative for guys to get consent education than for girls, because like our legal system puts a lot of responsibility on consent on guys, and then their complete lack of education. I haven't gotten any consent education whatsoever. My consent education is the logic that I hope I have, essentially. And I think that that guys need it. I think they should learn about it probably in middle school, actually, because for a lot of people, I think that's when they start like exploring and experimenting, and then maybe more in depth and in detail during like a high school class, like you're suggesting.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you guys think parents should have any sort of say in this? Not necessarily in high school, but like more in elementary school, middle school.
I think they should be involved in the conversation as to what their children are being taught and how they're being taught. But I think that there should definitely be a set curriculum that a lot of people have a say in. I think administration should be involved in making this curriculum, and I think they should get some parent perspectives, and they should get some student perspectives, and they should get teacher perspectives. And like, when you include more people in the conversation, you're able to please more people and allow to have a better education.
And then I think kind of more what Izzy was saying is like, so what do we do if there's like someone who's or like a family that's practicing abstinence, and like that's their religious perspective? Then how do we fill that gap for, I don't have an answer, but how do we fill that gap for, you know?
And that conversation
Students.
actually brings us onto a very pertinent topic for us because we live in Colorado. There's currently a bill in the state Senate that essentially forces public schools and charter schools to teach consent-based sexual education rather than abstinence-based. And a lot of people are up in arms because they think that it breaks their First Amendment rights of kind of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And it also, technically speaking, breaks the Colorado Constitution as well, as districts are given the authority to determine what their curriculum should be. What do you guys think about this bill?
I think it's really like groundbreaking and shows that we're striving for change, and personally I think it's a really good idea. I think like looking at the point of view of this violates like someone's religious beliefs and abstinence education and that kind of stuff. I think that no one's necessarily going to say go have sex in this education. Like no one's saying you can't be abstinent. No one's saying like you're not allowed to abstain.
Like just providing the other options.
Like it's just saying like if you do decide to do this, there's a safe way, because sex can be dangerous. There's STDs, there's pregnancies, and there's an emotional aspect as well. And I think that it's just acknowledging that it's something that can happen in your life, and it doesn't have to happen in your life. You don't have to have sex.
Yeah.
But if you choose to,
You should do it safely.
What do you think about that, Izzy?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that kids, you know, it's not an encouraging thing, it's an education thing, you know, and they're not encouraging you to go have sex, but if you do, you should know how to do it safely, and so you're not getting pregnant, you're not getting STDs, and you're knowing what those signs are, because you could really get yourself in a lot of trouble, and the other person as well, if you don't have the right amount of education.
Yeah. Do you guys think parents, at least for younger kids, should be allowed to opt their kids out of sex ed?
I mean, there are situations like you can honestly opt out of anything in school if a parent intervenes, down to like whatever those tests are that we all opt out of, like
Oh,
there's
yeah.
I don't know what they're called. Yeah. But like, I think that there would have to be some sort of incentive so that they don't, because I mean, you do have to get permission slips signed for certain things at school, and I understand that legally parents probably could opt their children out of it. But I don't know a way around it, but I wish that there was a way around, like just so that everyone got that education and there weren't kids missing out because of their parents' beliefs.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think that, I mean, I don't know, it's hard because of course you want to respect the parents and you want to respect the family's beliefs, whether it be religious or just personal beliefs, but also it's it's sometimes these kids that don't have the comprehensive
Yeah.
sex education course that helps them develop their like sense of knowledge for situations to come in high school, college, and just in the real world, like where they're dealing with that. And it's not even just like sex education, like consent education. It's just like the little things like that even you were talking about earlier that you felt like we got a lot of, like, I don't know, puberty and stuff. Like if they don't get that as well, like they need the whole picture to understand a lot of what's going on later in their life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would totally agree. What would yours like ideal sex education look like?
I mean, in the future, one day, like, it would start in kindergarten. Like, it'd be a normalized subject that isn't hard to talk about because it's literally just the functions of your body and, like, what the effects of when you do something to your body, the effects of it.
Yeah.
But, like, in the closer future, as we're working towards it, I do think that the ideal sex education for high school specifically is a health course that you take for an entire year, and it's required.
Yeah.
What do you think, Maya?
I don't know. I struggle with it in like upperclassmen years, like in middle school and even like high school, just because I know from personal experience it hasn't been like the most serious conversation, and I know that it's really hard to get people to like focus and for people to just stay on topic and like not make jokes. And I think that, again, what Sue was saying, starting it early is going to be important.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for being on our show.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks
for
for
having
coming.
us.
Make sure to follow our social media at MileHighDiscussions, and thank you for tuning in.
See you next week.